So Dr. Todd Kopelman is a licensed psychologist and board certified behavior analyst. He is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics. His primary clinical interests are the assessment of autism in children and adults and the evaluation and treatment of challenging behaviors in children and adults with developmental disabilities. He is the co-director of the University of Iowa Autism Center and has served as the coordinator for 3 federal research studies evaluating the use of telehealth to coach parents to evaluate and treat severe challenging behaviors displayed by their young children with autism, and co-teaches a graduate seminar on autism spectrum disorders. He has served as a board member on the Autism Society of Iowa since 2010. Dr. Matthew O'Brien is a clinical assistant professor of pediatrics at the University of Iowa Children's Hospital. He completed his doctorate in psychological and quantitative foundations from the University of Iowa and has completed postdoctoral fellowships in neuropsychology and behavior psychology at the University of Iowa as well. He serves as the Director of Biobehavioral Services and Director of Research in Psychology for the Iowa LEND program. He is also an investigator on the multi-site R01 research grant funded by the NIH evaluating behavioral assessment through telehealth and conducts research related to functional analysis of severe and challenging behavior in individuals with autism and other neurodevelopmental disorders. So both these gentlemen are going to speak today on COVID-19 and behavior and the common concerns with that. So thank you very much for taking time to present at our conference today.
All right, my pleasure. Thank you for that introduction, Roxanne and Chris. Can you guys hear me okay, Roxanne?
Yep.
Very good. All right. Well, happy Friday afternoon to everyone. So nice. I'm at home. I'm looking out my window with the blue skies and 70-degree weather. Looking forward to the weekend. Also wanted to say thank you to Matt. It's always a delight to have the opportunity to present with my good colleague in pediatrics. And just to say how much I've enjoyed the conference so far. The talks by Dr. Ball I thought were excellent, and the panel this afternoon, and really all of the material that's been shared. So I really enjoyed it. So as you can see from the title slide, Matt and I are going to be presenting together on the topic of common concerns and also practical strategies related to COVID-19. And so for this talk, we're both going to be putting on our clinical hats, so to speak, and discussing common questions that have come up over the past, I guess, 7 or 8 months from parents and caregivers related, again, to the coronavirus. And Matt's going to be in charge of the slides, so I'm going to be saying next a lot, and he's going to forward them. So whenever you're ready, Matt, next slide. And Matt, are you able to put it in the slideshow format?
You're muted, Matt.
All right.
Is that up, Todd?
Yeah, it looks like it's I think it's a little bit bigger now.
Okay.
So yeah, next slide.
Got it.
Thank you. So as far as an outline goes, I'm going to start off with kind of a bigger picture overview of why I think conceptually COVID-19 has presented some unique challenges for individuals on the autism spectrum, with the understanding, of course, that everybody on or off the spectrum is unique. And so some of these challenges will be more so for some and less so for others. But wanted to start there before we then go into talking about some of the more specific challenges. Certainly the very first one is probably the one that I hear about the most, which is how do I get my loved one with autism to wear a mask and to keep a mask on, followed by hand washing, which is really important always, but especially in this day and age of COVID. And then social distancing. How do we keep that 6 foot or so barrier safely? And then finally, with all of these changes in school routines and school schedules, what can we do to best support children on the autism spectrum? And then finally, we wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. So there should be, I'm guessing, 15 minutes at least. And we did that really for two reasons. Number one, it's Friday afternoon. This is the last talk of the conference, and we didn't want to overwhelm you with a lot of information. There certainly will be useful information, I hope, but didn't want to have too much. And then number two, frankly, we're 6 or 7 months into the pandemic at this point. And so I'm guessing those who are still struggling with these issues might have fairly unique circumstances, and we're not going to be able to address everything in a more general presentation. So we wanted to save some time at the end to try and problem solve for anybody who does have one of those more challenging cases. Okay, next slide. All right, so I'm probably gonna win the most obvious statement of the year award here. And I'll own that one, but I just wanted to start off frankly and say that, coronavirus has been extremely challenging on everyone. I don't know anybody who has not been either very directly affected or indirectly impacted by what's been going on, in the country and in the world, frankly, over this last 7 or 8 months. Next slide, Matt. Just thinking about Iowa, our state alone, this data is a day or two old, so unfortunately, it's probably only increased. But there have been over 140,000 cases of coronavirus in our state, and unfortunately, over 1,800 deaths at this point. And working at the hospital in Iowa City, we hear quite a bit about what's going on. And really, the medical professionals are expecting a surge or an increase in cases over the next few months. And so I think the reality is, as much as I know everybody else just wants this to be over, we're probably going to continue to struggle with this quite a bit. Hopefully not for too long, but definitely over the next few months is what I'm hearing, is that cases are going to increase quite a bit, is what's the estimate. Next slide. So while keeping that in mind, that COVID affects everyone, I really do think that in thinking about autism, there are some unique features of the disorder that have made what's been happening over the last several months even more challenging. And really the reason we wanted to point that out is because if we don't appreciate some of these unique challenges that many individuals on the spectrum face, we're not going to understand, where they're coming from as much, and we're not going to be as sensitive to it. And I think it's just going to limit our ability to provide the type of help, support, and understanding that as providers we really should be doing. Next slide. So I think, again, this is just kind of big picture issues of why coronavirus has been particularly challenging for many people on the spectrum, not all, but many. And I think the biggest one is just understanding why, what is going on. I feel very fortunate, again, to work in the hospital and to be able to talk to medical professionals all the time. But if I didn't have that opportunity, or if I had maybe some developmental concerns or cognitive concerns, and all of a sudden, starting last spring, everybody's staying away from everybody else, and everybody's wearing masks, and everybody's cleaning everything all of the time, and my school is shut down. And if I wasn't able to understand really what was driving all of that, it would have been obviously exponentially more frustrating and scary of an experience. And for some of the individuals that I get to work with, they're still struggling with that why piece. What is happening? And also, when is this going to end? When are we going to go back to the way things used to be? And I know for all of us, those questions are probably in the forefront of our mind, but I think even more so for some individuals with autism. So that's a big part of it. Next slide. And then another issue is just all of the new social expectations that have occurred since last spring. So as we all know, we're doing our best to keep distance. That 6 feet is that magical number apparently that we try and maintain. And we've really had to limit how we interact with people. We're not having, for the most part, those parties that we used to, or those social get-togethers, or even, things like having lunch with my colleagues that I used to take for granted. We're very much more thoughtful about that than we used to be. And that's a tricky thing for individuals, many individuals with autism. And as a clinician, again, putting on my hat as a clinical psychologist, it's really been challenging because one of the things that we try and do the most in many cases, especially with children who are recently diagnosed, is look for social opportunities, right? Because that's one of the skill areas that's often identified as in need of enhancement. And with COVID, a lot of those opportunities, they just frankly don't exist right now. So it's really, really challenging to work on those skills when we have to balance that with health and safety. Next slide. And then another big issue, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the presentation, is the lack of predictability. And this goes back to that understanding piece that we talked about just a few minutes ago. But boy, in our society, I can't think of more dramatic changes that have occurred that quickly. I know in Iowa City, before spring break, everything seemed the same and our kids were going to school on their normal schedule. And then they didn't go back to school. And they had this 3-week period where it seemed like nothing was really happening. And then they jumped into this online learning model. And it seems like across the state, talking to different teachers and families right now, things look different for everybody. So some students are back in school full time. Some students are at home full time, and some are in a hybrid model. And we'll talk about this later, but regardless, things are different. And that is very stressful for a lot of individuals on the spectrum, not to have that predictability that they were used to. Next slide. Another probably Mr. Obvious point here, I apologize, and we're going to talk more about this later, but one of the things I hear a lot from parents about are issues like mask wearing and sensory concerns that have come about as a result of COVID. I think many people would prefer, if not everyone, to not have to wear a mask, but I'm fortunate that it doesn't cause huge sensory issues for me, but that's not the case for everybody. And so on top of just kind of general, maybe not understanding why we have to do this, is maybe or definitely for some individuals, extreme physical discomfort associated with wearing masks. Next slide. So I think if you put all of this together, what I'm hearing a lot is that for some persons on the spectrum, we're seeing a lot more anxiety. So anxiety related to not understanding what's going on and when things are going to change, anxiety related to the changes in the routine and schedule, anxiety related to having to wear masks, anxiety related to seeing other people wearing masks. That's quite a different presentation when you're seeing somebody at the hospital or at school, and now a big portion of their face is covered. So all of these changes really seem to be causing, for some people, a lot of anxiety to spike, and in some individuals too, increased irritability and challenging behaviors. So I think just keeping that in mind, that perspective as we go into some of the more detailed issues is really important. Okay, so now we'll get into the details a little bit. So the first issue Matt and I wanted to talk about, and it's probably the most common question that I get, is mask wearing. And to be honest, and I think Dr. Ball mentioned this in his talk this morning, at this point in time, many children with autism, many adults with autism are wearing masks, and it's gotten a lot better. So I think if Matt and I were giving this talk in April, it would have been quite different than it is today. That said, there certainly are many individuals on the spectrum that I see in clinic who still struggle with wearing the mask or keeping it on for long periods of time. Next slide. So what I'm going to do is start off with some very general suggestions, things to think about as parents or care providers. If you have somebody you love with autism who's struggling with this, things to keep in mind, and then we will go into more specific strategies. Okay, go ahead, Matt. So starting off with this picture here, just a visual, again, to keep in mind. If you have a child or an adult on the spectrum who is struggling with mask wearing, you've probably tried a lot of things already. And all I want to urge you here is slow and steady. Consistency is going to win the race. Matt may have some magic that I don't have, and if so, feel free to speak up. But none of the strategies we're going to share with you today are going to result in overnight changes. I wish I could say, do this, and I guarantee in 24 hours, your kid's going to wear a mask wherever you want them to. That's not the case. But I can say that these are pretty tried and true strategies. And in many cases, they can be very effective if done repetitively. And that takes me to the next point, which is a related one, which is just practice, practice, practice. I know that's not a sexy or exciting thing to say, but it's a really important one. You know, the more we practice the strategies Matt and I are going to talk about, oftentimes the more that they'll become a habit or a routine, and they'll become the expected for that child. And usually that's when we see progress, is over time. Okay, next slide. So I think step one in trying to help with mask wearing is just to think about where a child or an adult is developmentally. And I think it's always a good place to start off with providing information that's appropriate to that person about why it's important to wear a mask. So from a developmental standpoint, starting with the why. And you know, the most basic is coronavirus is out there and it can make us sick. And we can go into more or less detail about what coronavirus is, depending on where that individual is developmentally. Number two, wearing a mask can keep you safe and other people around you safe. Next point is where it is that a mask is expected to be worn. And again, this is going to vary person to person. So this is just kind of some general recommendations. But for example, you might have to suggest or indicate a school, right? Most schools, not all, but most schools, it's my understanding, are expecting mask wearing or strongly encouraging it. I know at the hospital where I work, it's a requirement. If you're going to come to our hospital, that you have to wear a mask. Stores is another one where, again, it varies store to store, but at the very least, for the most part, it's a strong expectation.
Can I show you something?
Yeah, is that you, Kelly? Oh, I guess not. So I think related to that is where not to wear a mask. So just as important as talking about the wear part is the conditions under which you don't have to wear one. So maybe at home, I'm guessing at home, you don't have to wear a mask. If you're outside in a park, you're by yourself, you're with just your family, whatever your group is that you're comfortable with from a health and safety standpoint, it's okay, no mask there. And then getting into the mechanics of it, the specifics, the how, what kind of mask, you know, are we expecting this child or individual to wear? Really important is what is the right way to wear it. That's something that we see a lot at the hospital is some individuals know perfectly how to wear a mask, but oftentimes I'll see somebody wearing a mask, but it's not covering their nose, for example. And so then we have to just do some education and some training about that. So kind of the bottom line is when we're providing this information, it needs to be developmentally appropriate. And I would really focus on keeping it simple, accurate, and positive. We don't want to scare individuals. And I wouldn't give a doom and gloom scenario that if you don't wear a mask, you know, these horrible things are going to happen. That's not very helpful. But I think providing accurate health information in a positive way is really the way to go. Dr. Ball talked earlier this morning about that he's a fan of social narratives or social stories, depending on the terminology. And I think as a first step, you know, the explaining part, that's a very reasonable thing to do. And I'm not going to show these here, but I have some links to some what I thought were pretty cool social stories or social narratives. Again, it's really important to think about the child or adult who you have in mind to make sure that it's going to be appropriate for them. There's not one social story for mask wearing that's going to work for everyone. I think we're going to show a clip next on the next slide that lasts for about 3 minutes. And this, again, is not going to work for everyone. But if you know somebody who is a fan of Sesame Street and Julia, who's the character that they developed a few years ago, who's on the autism spectrum, this might be a cool way to go. And I really liked this clip because I think from a just kind of a science standpoint, they do a pretty good job of explaining some of the simple steps that you can use.
Hey, Todd, let me know if it's playing. Can you see the video now?
I can see it. Yep.
Okay, great.
Daddy!
Hey, Julia. Mommy said you wanted to talk to me. I hear you're going someplace exciting.
Park!
Oh, you're going to have so much fun. Now, honey, remember, if you go outside, you need to wear your mask. That's how we keep everybody healthy and safe.
No!
Hey, honey, why don't you go ahead and put your mask on right now?
No!
You don't want to put your mask on?
No! Ears.
Oh, it bothers your ears?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, masks can bother your ears when you first start to wear them. But,
Nose.
Oh, yeah, they can tickle your nose too. You know, we just need to practice wearing our masks and then it won't bother you so much. Hey, Julia, who do we know that's good at wearing their mask?
Oh, good. Footster.
Mm-hmm.
Footster.
Yeah, your mommy told me Fluffster's been practicing with you. Looking good there, pal. Hey, Julia, let's have Mommy help you put your mask on, and we can practice with Fluffster.
Practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh. So, Fluffster, how's it going?
There you are, sweetie. Go practice with Daddy.
Oh, I know masks can take time to get used to, but I like how cool your mask is.
Painted it.
Oh, I see that. You painted your mask to make it extra special.
Bunny.
That bunny nose you painted makes you look just like Fluffster. Hey, is your mask as soft as Fluffster?
Soft.
Good. A soft mask feels a lot nicer on your face. Oh, honey, do you want to put your mask on? Oh, look, why don't we practice wearing it for just a little bit first, okay?
Fluffster.
Oh, of course. Fluffster and I will both practice with you. Here. Just wear it while I count to 5, okay, honey? Fluffster, you ready? Okay, here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yay!
Yay is right. You did great, sweetheart. You wore your mask for 5 whole seconds. Honey, you're still with 6 seconds, 7 seconds, 8 seconds. Wow, you're really good at this, Julia. And you know, it just gets easier every time you wear it. And hey, now you're ready to go to the park.
Park!
Oh, and don't forget Fluffster. He's doing a great job wearing his mask, too.
Fluffster, too.
Bye-bye, honey. Have fun.
Bye-bye, Daddy. Yay, park.
Yay, park.
All right. Thanks, Matt.
Now are we back to the PowerPoint?
Yep.
Okay, great.
So just one example out there. Again, not going to be motivating or interesting for everyone, but it might be for some. And we're not expecting everybody to wear their mask as well as quickly as Julia did in that 3-minute clip. But I did like some of the strategies that they incorporated. And I'm actually going to be talking about some of them next. So again, step 1, provide information about the why in a developmentally appropriate way. The second is to offer choices. There's a lot of research in the behavioral area that indicates that choice making is a really important ingredient, so to speak, in increasing compliance. We all like to be given choices when possible. So these are just some examples of the types of choices I think that we can definitely give to children and adults. So as far as what kind of mask, pick your color. We all have preferences, I think, about, color and things like that. Maybe certain characters. I'll show some examples of this in a minute. Decorating the mask, just like Julia did, for some young kids can be, and adults too, can be very appealing as well. You can just make it more palatable. Number 2 there is pick the material. there are a lot of different materials out there. Listed some of the more common ones, but cotton, polyester, and then there are a lot of blends that you can see there. And so what works for one child might not work for another. So you just have to, I think, do some trial and error, some experimentation. And I'll show some pictures of this in a minute too. But in addition to the different colors and different materials, there are different ways to position or secure a mask from a sensory standpoint that might be beneficial for some individuals. I just do want to point out, and this is more me putting on a public health hat, that we know that high thread counts for masks do tend to provide a little bit more protection. Multiple layers, if you have like a 3-layer, tri-layer mask, that tends to work better as far as blocking out those bad germs than a single one. And fit is really important too. So if it's too loose or too tight, we don't want that. And then it's also really important just to be aware of the requirements in the setting. So some places you could just maybe wear a buff instead of a mask, whereas in other settings, you may have to wear a mask. And some, a shield might be okay, and in others, not so much. So just be aware of that when you're doing the practice. All right, next slide. So just want to show some examples, and there are hundreds and hundreds out there. It's crazy to think back to this time last year to think that now we would be talking about, masks and things like that. That would have been the furthest thing from my mind last November. But, if your child's into superheroes or your adult child, try out some cool masks. I wouldn't mind wearing some of those. Next slide. If they like certain colors, you could pick out a different colored mask every single day of the week, which could be fun, for a child maybe who's attending school. Next slide. This is getting into kind of different ways that you can fasten masks. So this type of an approach, using a button, might, if somebody doesn't like to feel that wrapping around their ear, this type of an approach might be more successful. A variation in the next slide is a baseball cap. So I've definitely seen some children wearing a mask like this, and their parents have told me that their kids really dig it. It's much more tolerable to them than the traditional mask that loops around the ears. Less pressure there. Next one is fasteners in the back. I've seen some individuals wearing masks like this. And again, it's just, I think, a sensory or pressure issue, and trial and error with each individual. Next one, Matt. This is from a small business that developed masks for individuals with different types of developmental disabilities. So this is kind of a mask shield combo. Again, I'm not trying to sell anything or make any promises that one approach is going to work better than the other. But I think the important thing to keep in mind is there are so many options out there to choose from that a little bit of exploration can be helpful, and giving your child a choice might be really beneficial. All right. Now I'm going to kind of get into the nitty gritty here. So once you've explained why we have to wear a mask and you've given these choices and hopefully found one that's a little bit more palatable for your loved one, then I think we need to get down to how are we going to promote mask wearing? And I'm going to take a pretty behavioral approach because this is an approach that's been found to help with a lot of different issues, mask wearing being one of them. And I think a good starting point is just to do a task analysis. And Dr. Ball talked about this morning, which is great. So a task analysis is just the process of breaking a skill, in this case, mask wearing, into smaller and more manageable pieces. So once you've identified each of those steps, you can use that to teach this new skill that might be really tricky to try and do all at once. So we're just trying to simplify things with a task analysis rather than achieve a goal of mask wearing all at once. Next one. So this is a sample task analysis. There's not one task analysis out there for wearing masks, and I would really recommend basing your task analysis, if you decide to do this, on your own child or loved one and which skills maybe they've already mastered and which ones they haven't. But you can see here there's about 7 different steps, and I'll go through each one of them. this is for somebody who's just starting off. So step one might be just holding the mask in your hand and tolerating that for a few seconds. You don't have to put it on your face yet. You're just going to get used to holding it. And then step two is, okay, now we're going to touch the mask to your face. You don't have to wear it, but we're going to move from it's in your hands to you're touching it to your face. Okay, now we're progressing a little bit further. You're going to put a mask around one of your ears for a short period of time. So maybe it's your left ear, maybe it's your right ear, but just one ear. Do that for a few seconds until it's tolerated. Okay, we're moving up the chain. Now we're going to put it around the other ear. So if you started with left, now we're going with the right. Step 5 would be, okay, we've done those things. You can put it on your chin now. And we would model that, maybe show them how to do it, and then have the child or adult meet that requirement. Again, probably just for a few seconds. Now it's covering your lips, so one step closer. And then finally, it's covering your nose. So really breaking it down one step at a time, each step building upon the other. So once we've gone through those steps, and hopefully the individual that we're working with is wearing the mask for, a very short period of time, I think the next step is to increase what we call tolerance. The amount of time that the individual can successfully wear that mask. And again, going back to that picture of the turtle, slow and steady wins the race, especially for children who are a little bit more averse to wearing it, or adults. So you might just start off with 5 seconds or 10 seconds, and then you're done. Once you're successful, a rule of thumb could be to try and double it. So you might go to 20 or 30 seconds, and then a minute. And the rest of this, you can probably predict what's going to happen, but gradually we're going to increase the amount of time until we get to whatever goal you feel like is needed for your child. In my clinical experience, there's usually a point, it seems like, where once you can get past a few minutes, and usually it's around 2 minutes or so, you start to see a lot of success. And there's just kind of a breakthrough where the individual realizes, I can do this, it's not so bad. And also that it's the expectation. All right, next slide. So just some additional strategies that I found can be helpful for behaviors like increasing compliance with mask wearing. And I kind of got to these earlier, and Dr. Ball was mentioning them as well. Next slide, Matt. But signals, I think signals for individuals on the spectrum, lots of research over the last 4 decades or so that visual supports can be extremely helpful. So there are a lot of different ways that these signals can be delivered. And by signal, I just mean some type of a cue or a visual that something is happening or is not happening. So it could be a timer, for example, for when we're working on the tolerance, how long do you have to wear the mask? So the individual can see, okay, this is when it's over. For younger children, it might be as simple as mom or dad or a grandparent holding up their fingers, counting down from 5 or 10. And when it's over, then you can take the mask off. A lot of different ways to do this. Those are just 2 examples. Next slide. Kind of additional strategies would be color coding systems. So one approach that I've used for other behaviors is a green and red card or a button that you would have out to signal to the individual when the mask needs to be on and when it needs to be off. So green might mean on. So you could have a lanyard with a laminated green card, keep it very low tech, very simple, and you would show that to your child. And when the green is out, you've got to wear your mask. As soon as you flip it to red, you can take it off. That can be very helpful. Next slide. And then this is really important, so I didn't mean to leave it for last in the sense that it's not important, but having a reinforcement plan, motivating an individual to wear a mask, especially if they're highly resistant, can be a very, very important part of the puzzle, so to speak. So really focus on success. And again, Dr. Ball talked about this really well this morning, I thought. It could be as simple as providing a lot of praise, high fives, hugs, if your child likes that. If they don't, then don't use that. positive attention, and reinforcing effort, as well as success. I really like how you're touching that mask. I really like how you're holding it up to your face, being enthusiastic. And everybody is unique, so it's the type of attention that that individual really likes. Access to a favorite item while the mask is on is another approach. So making this up, but if you have a child that really likes a tablet, an iPad, for example, as long as they have the mask on, they can hold on to their iPad. A related approach would be called a DRA system, and Matt's going to talk about this, I think, a little bit later with other behaviors, but differentially reinforcing a behavior that we want to see more of. So if you've kept on your mask for 30 seconds, then you get your iPad, right? You've earned it through good behavior. For some individuals, that might be a really helpful approach. And then another alternative to that would be just when we're starting off, pair the mask wearing with a preferred activity. So if you know a child really likes to swing, for example, you might want to start off with swinging while wearing a mask. If you can associate those two things together, they might be more motivated or inclined to keep that mask on because they're doing something that they really enjoy. Final point I want to make here is with a reinforcement plan, it's so important to individualize it. So what is motivating for Matt might be different than what's motivating for me and vice versa, right? And the same for everybody else out there. So I can't tell you one universal plan because we're all unique, which is really cool. So we have to do some work up front to figure out what might motivate each person to wear a mask. All right, next slide.
All right, I'll take over from here if that's okay, Todd.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about hand washing during a pandemic. I will say, and I have to admit, about a year ago, if you would have told me I'd be talking about hand washing at ASI this year, I would have laughed. As some of you know, my real expertise is in severe and challenging behavior, but I found myself over the last 7 or 8 months really focusing on skill development, skill acquisition more than I ever have in my career. And a lot of that has to do with the changes. You know, we're asking kids to do things, not just kids on the spectrum, but all kids to do things that are maybe not natural. Now, I will say, I kind of laugh about hand washing and the idea that teaching hand washing skills can be really difficult, but for anybody who's been in a male bathroom in the last, 18 years, I think all males probably struggle with this. So about half the population maybe needs some of this. But joking aside, I think there are some particular challenges with individuals with autism when it comes to teaching hand washing skills. One of those challenges is the idea of a sensory sensitivity. So for some individuals on the spectrum, and even those who aren't, there may be some sensations with water play that may be aversive. It could be aversive to rub the hands together with soap. There's a lot of different kind of feelings associated with hand washing that may just not be comfortable, so what may make it a little bit harder. Another, although contrasting side of this is that there are a lot of sensory interests. In my day treatment clinic where we work with severe and challenging behaviors, a common issue that we see is kids really interested in going out and playing with water. So sometimes we have to block the water fountains or the sinks when that's all they want to do. So that can be a challenge if you're trying to teach hand washing and the kid wants to play in the water for long periods of time. And then the third, which is probably an issue with most people, not just individuals on the spectrum, is knowing when to wash. Do I only wash my hands after I touch a doorknob? Do I wash my hands after I play with something that could be dirty? Do I wash my hands when I don't touch anything but I'm at the store? And knowing when to do that can be really challenging. So, I don't want to simply repeat everything that was said by Dr. Ball or by Todd. But I will say, if you've heard now 3 people mention this, it must be pretty important. So creating a task analysis is really important for learning new skills. As Todd talked about, it's all about breaking down the tasks into more manageable pieces. And when we think about a task analysis, we think about these general steps to doing it. The first is identifying the goal. So you're going to want to operationalize that to the best of your ability. So it might be Johnny will wash his hands with soap and water for 20 consecutive seconds. The second step in that is to determine the skills that already exist. So taking a step back, when we're teaching new skills, it may be that the individual has those skills. So it's not always teaching new skills, but it also may be some compliance issues. So for example, my son doesn't always make his bed. Is that because he doesn't have the skills to do it, or is that because he doesn't want to do it? Well, if it's the more the motivation side, we might be in a different situation where we may not need a task analysis. But in this case, assuming that the individual doesn't have the skills, we need to determine what skills they already have that would allow us to create that task analysis. And I'll get into a couple sample task analyses in a second. The third is breaking the task down into manageable steps. And the point of a task analysis really is to take something that could be complex to somebody and break it into these manageable steps where they can accomplish the steps in the right sequence. We also want to remember that the goal in the end is to take all these steps and blend them together. So if I told some of you, I want you to go boil some water. Many of you already understand all of the steps involved in that. But if you had to break it down to somebody who had never done it before, you think about all the little aspects that you maybe don't even think about. I have to get a pot out. I have to turn the water on. I have to decide how much water goes in there. So there's a lot of things to learn when it comes to hand washing, and we want to make it as simplified as possible. The fourth, and as Todd mentioned, and I think Dr. Ball did earlier today, determining the reinforcers is going to be key. Not everything should be considered a reinforcer. Praise isn't always a reinforcer for some behaviors. Stickers aren't always reinforcers. We have to do we have to use what we think is really motivating to that individual. And then the fifth is deciding which behavioral strategy to use, whatever makes the most sense, what's practical for you, but also we think is based upon good behavioral principles. And I will say there are so many different ways to do this. I'm focusing on breaking it down into a task analysis, but you don't always necessarily need to do that. And there's so many decisions to make within a task analysis. So here's a sample of a written task analysis. Now, this may not need to be broken down as much as it is here for some children. For other children, it may need to be way more detailed. But think about these steps as we go through them, and also be thinking about anything that might be missing here. So if you were to teach your child or your student or another individual to wash their hands, what steps are missing out of this task analysis, or what steps do you think are already learned that you wouldn't have to do? So we might start with turning on the water. Well, what if you have two sets of knobs? One's hot, one's cold. Getting both hands wet, pumping soap on one hand, rubbing palms of hand together for 10 seconds. Now this brings in a time element. Todd talked about visual timers, which is a perfect time to introduce that, would be when we start talking about time, because even individuals who maybe have worked with time quite a bit may not fully understand what 10 seconds looks like. Rubbing palms of the hands on the back of both hands for 5 seconds, and then maybe rubbing between fingers of both hands for 5 seconds to make sure you get in between. Rinsing both hands until all the soap is gone, turning the water off, shaking the hands over the sink, placing both hands on paper towel, rubbing the paper towel over hands until dry, and then throwing the paper towel away. So that's a lot of steps. And over time, you would hope that you could collapse some of those into kind of one step. So maybe it's get both hands wet. Well, if the individual knows how to turn the water on, they do that and get their hands wet. You may not have to tell them, turn on the water. So I just showed you a written schedule, but the truth is, as Todd mentioned earlier, a lot of individuals tend to be more visually focused, or what if they're non-readers or don't have reading skills? Then we want to use visuals. Sometimes the visuals can be paired with the written as well, so that we can follow along and really structures it up nicely. Here's a couple examples of visual task analyses. They look just like a picture schedule in some sense, but the truth is they're just a way of sequencing the steps in a way that the individual who you're going to use them with understands them. So how do we get somebody through a task analysis? I know Dr. Ball spent a little bit of time on this morning. I wanted to give you just a little more kind of diverse range of opportunities when we think about how to go through these schedules, because chaining could be done in a lot of different ways. One form of chaining is called forward chaining. And in forward chaining, what you're going to do is you're going to teach the first step first. Until that person gets that first step right, we're not going to move on to teaching that second step. So what we might do is we might just teach the first step for a while until they get it. And then we might start teaching the first step plus the second step. And then we might start teaching the first, second, and third. But what you could be doing throughout forward chaining is you could actually be teaching them the first step, and then you help them through all the rest of the steps. So there's, like I said, there's different ways to do this. You don't have to just teach the first step and be done. Backwards chaining involves prompting through all of those steps except for the final step. So if we go back onto that written task analysis, what we may do is we may prompt somebody through turn on the water, get both hands wet, and keep going. And then on step 13, we pull back our prompting so that they're just throwing the paper towel away by themselves. We're teaching that one aspect. Then as they get that down, the next time we do this, they're going to get steps 12 and 13 together, and so on and so forth. In backwards chaining, as opposed to forwards chaining, which you can do it either way, you don't always go through the entire chain in forward chaining, but in backward chaining, you typically do, because it doesn't make much sense just to throw away a paper towel. Then you're just playing paper towel basketball. Another way to do this is teaching the individual steps. So if somebody gets stuck on certain steps, say they just don't know how to turn the water on, or they just don't know how to dry their hands, you could certainly focus on just teaching that individual step and doing it over and over again until they have it, so they understand what the expectation is and they do it successfully. So you don't have to do the entire chain. This would be for somebody who maybe gets a lot of the pieces to it, but doesn't get them all, and there's one that really is sticky for them. And then there's something called total task teaching. And that's where you go through the chain and typically, or the task analysis, and typically you're going to look for those areas where they struggle, and you're going to teach those specific skill deficits and provide support as needed just for those, but you're going to go through the chain each time. Then we have what are called prompting strategies. And prompting is just a way of signaling or presenting some kind of stimulus that increases the probability that they're going to do that behavior. So a prompt could be simply a vocal prompt. I need you to turn on the water. It could be visual. I could just show them, or modeling. I could show them how to do it. But we have two ways to do this. One is called most to least. With most to least, what you're going to do is you're essentially going to do it for them, with them at the very first trial. And the reason why we might use most to least is because they've never done it before. We want to give them the experience of doing it right off the bat. This is, by the way, this is not something that I'm going to discuss in relationship to compliance. I'm not talking about physically making somebody do this. What I'm doing is showing them by taking their hand and doing it hand over hand to give them the sense of what it's like. And then what you do is as they're successful with that, you would back off, and now it's just a partial physical prompt. So maybe my hand's on them, but I'm not actually guiding them the entire way. And then it's modeling it for them, then verbally prompting, then visually prompting. And then ultimately the goal is that we don't prompt them at all, right? We want them just to see that there's the sink, I turn on the water. Least to most goes the other way. With least to most, what you're going to do is see, do they do it without any help to start with? So if we get to the sink and I don't prompt them to turn the water on, do they do that on their own? And if they don't, then what I'm going to do is maybe use some kind of visual. I might show them a picture, or I might tell them to do it, or I might model in verbal. And so we go down that list of more intensive or more kind of restrictive and somewhat intrusive prompts, but it's really in the name of helping them learn how to do it. And then, as Todd talked about earlier, and I think is really important for us to hit home, is it's so important to identify the potential reinforcer. I know for some of you have heard me talk about reinforcement and punishment, you'll recognize this, but I sometimes think about country music as maybe the most aversive thing in the world. And in fact, I oftentimes think if somebody played country music with a certain movement of mine, I would not do that movement ever again. It just is aversive. But for some people, it's a reinforcer. It's so pleasurable. And the reason why I say that is it's individualized. You cannot identify something like a sticker that's going to be preferred by everybody. It just isn't. But there's other dimensions of reinforcement that we have to think about. One is the immediacy. If I'm going to go through a task analysis, the thing that I have to realize is if I don't provide that reinforcer immediately, it's probably not going to strengthen that behavior the way we want it to. We know from basic research and even some applied research that about 30 seconds is the threshold with which you have to deliver that consequence for it to be the most meaningful. After 30 seconds, it starts to lose its value. So if you're going to run through some kind of skill acquisition program, but you're going to reward a kid later in the day, it's going to be a lot less effective than if you do it right when you work on it. The second is magnitude. Magnitude just refers to the size of it, how much of it. 5 minutes of iPad time may not be as valuable as 30 minutes of iPad time. However, do we want to always give 30 minutes of iPad time? Maybe not. But for the skills that they're struggling with, the greater magnitude, the skills that they're doing great with, maybe we pull back on the magnitude of that. The schedule of reinforcement. Are we giving them these reinforcers for every piece in the task analysis? Are we doing it at the end of the chain? When do we deliver those really matters. And then quality or preference. I think Dr. Ball talked about this earlier today, running preference assessments. There's really good research to show, and this is no offense to parents and teaching everybody, that parents, teachers, family members of individuals, not just with autism, but with other disabilities, tend to be really poor at predicting what those reinforcers are for kids when we actually run preference assessments. It's not that they can't identify them, but the consistency of their predictions isn't great. And then the fifth is satiation. We worked with a kid not long ago in my clinic who basically was on an iPad all day long. And then when we tried to use the iPad as a reinforcer, it had no value. I mean, the kid was just so satiated by using it. So in that case, we probably don't want to use those things that they already have tons of access to. If I'm wanting to teach a really important skill, I typically want to use something that may be pulled back from at other times so that they're not always accessing that. We call that a closed economy. Essentially, it's only available when we do our hand washing. Okay, hand washing was the easy one. Social distancing is really hard. Once again, I can't find too many adults who do a good job with this. So to expect kids to do it, it's a tall task. With social distancing, there are some additional special considerations, and these are not necessarily only particular to people on the spectrum, but I think we see these a lot. One is that there's challenges with personal space. I have some individuals I work with who really struggle to give me space, and then I work with some individuals who give me way too much space. I want to work with them, but they don't feel comfortable in close quarters. So with social distancing, we're talking about giving a little more space, and yet for some individuals, it's hard to do that. Discriminating an acceptable distance. What is 6 feet? We have a hard time teaching that to people, either because the element of distance is really hard to understand, or just being able to estimate it when you don't have something visual in front of you to show you. And then discriminating who to distance from. One of the things in COVID that we've had to be careful about is we don't want to teach kids to distance from everybody. We want them to be close to their family. We want them to be close to mom. We see this sometimes when we teach personal space and things like signs of affection. I don't want somebody to give every stranger a hug, but if they want to give a family member a hug, that's absolutely acceptable. So we have to help them discriminate when and where. So with social distancing, you certainly can think about a task analysis, but I generally think it's hard to do because there aren't a lot of skills involved. It's simply being able to know the distance. And so the first step in developing some kind of what we call differential reinforcement plan, and just let me explain what a differential reinforcement plan is. It's basically teaching somebody that reinforcement comes by kind of following these parameters. By staying 6 feet apart, good things might come. When you break that, when you aren't 6 feet away, you might not get those same benefits. The first step is identifying those potent reinforcers. So what is it that motivates this person? As Todd talked about, the iPad seems to be such a strong potent reinforcer for so many, and sometimes we can use that. But what if we're out in public and we don't want to bring an iPad along? So we have to identify what those potent reinforcers are and whether we can use them. The second step, determine the target for reinforcement. Here we're talking about 6 feet. We're not talking about 72 inches, which, we're talking about a kind of a general estimate. And that's a hard thing for people to do, is to estimate 6 feet, but that's our goal. Third is determining the schedule for reinforcement. As Todd mentioned, I'm going to real quickly explain the difference between DRA and DRO. So DRA is differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. Differential reinforcement of alternative behavior focuses on reinforcement for some specific behavior, something we want to increase. And so if somebody stands 6 feet away, the reinforcer is delivered. They get that. But if they don't stand 6 feet away, the reinforcer is not delivered. A DRO, or continued reinforcement, can be done in a couple ways. One way to do it is, hey, you get to continue to have your iPad and walk with your iPad, but if you don't stay 6 feet, then you can't have access to it anymore. And what we're doing there, we're saying, hey, if you do anything other than stay, or if you do anything other than come close, closer than 6 feet, you get to keep having access to that reinforcer. Or the other way to do it is, every so often, if you're 6 feet away, you can get that reinforcer. It's not every single time you're 6 feet away. The fourth step is the teaching part, and that's really the hard part. The best way to address teaching is to use visuals. At least that's my experience. And what are those visuals? We could be talking about anything from some kind of tape measure. We could be talking about, in some cases I've seen people use, and I think I mentioned this actually a little bit later, people use like pool noodles and stretch those out and show how far that is. But there's got to be something that gives the person a sense of what 6 feet is. And then, as Todd mentioned earlier as well, it's conducting many trials. It's practice, 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 practice. You want to conduct the trials in a tightly controlled environment, in a place where there aren't too many variables to deal with. So let's do this at home first, where we don't have to worry about all kinds of strangers or people getting in our space. And then let's go and build in generalization. Let's go to the places where we need to practice this and keep on working on it. So an example for a differential reinforcement system would look something like this. Begin with the rationale. Why do we need to stay 6 feet apart? Using visuals, Todd talked about social narratives. Generally speaking, it's all about just having that basic rationale there. It does not mean that they have to fully understand it. My son doesn't have to understand why he has to make his bed. I just want him to do it. And so in some cases, they don't have to fully get it. The second step, describing the skills in a way that makes sense. So you might create a list of the rules or visuals that hopefully resonate with the individual. Demonstrating the skills, using implements, as I mentioned earlier, using like a pool noodle, using your arm length, a broomstick, a hula hoop to show kind of that circle with which you have to stay out of. And then you're going to use this kind of practice of prompting the individual, observing the individual, and then reinforcing or providing some correction. And when I say correction, just teaching them what we're asking them to do. Once again, practicing in safe places to start with, and then going on to generalize to natural environments. So social distancing is really hard. It's especially hard when I talk about that estimation of 6 feet. So if you just can't do that, I think you can always think about what are called antecedent strategies. And antecedent strategies are the things that we do to prevent challenges with what we're trying to work on anyway. So preventing an individual from struggling with the 6 feet distance, from getting too close to people. So one of those would be avoiding dense spaces. Let's avoid going to, I think we probably should all avoid going to kind of closed indoor spaces, but dense spaces where there's lots of people that make it harder to keep 6 feet. Another one is buffering between people. If I'm a parent, I'm with my child, and I want my child to stay 6 feet from others, I may want to stay between my child and others just to kind of be that buffer for them. They don't necessarily have to estimate. In that case, I'm kind of doing it for them. The need for hand holding. I don't think that it's always appropriate to hold hands, but I think when we're talking about safety, an example of hand holding that we've oftentimes really promoted is when you're walking across the street and there's cars coming, we want you to hold your child's hand to make sure they're safe. This may be a similar case. We may need to hold that individual's hand just to assure that they're going to be safe. And then finally, reduce the need for discrimination. So like in schools, they're doing a great job of creating assigned spaces where people are 6 feet apart. If you can do that in the natural environment, so hey, we're going to be on this swing, it's 2 swings over from the nearest person. In that case, we've kind of given you the distance of 6 feet without having to promote the need to discriminate. All right, Todd, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you, Matt. So last thing we want to go through, and then we should have time for questions, is another challenging one, which is adapting to all of the changes that have happened at school for a lot of students. Next slide. So one of the diagnostic criteria for autism, I'm guessing most people are familiar with this, is a strong preference for predictability. And there are a lot of terms that are pretty much the same, but sometimes you'll see resistance to change or insistence on sameness, inflexibility, or even rigidity. And those all refer really to the fact that when something occurs that's different than what is expected, that can be very challenging for somebody on the autism spectrum. You know, to be honest, I think that can be challenging for anybody. I think most of us prefer to wake up and have a sense of what's going on that day, but even more so for somebody with autism. So when things are not predictable, research suggests that may result in an increase in anxiety, frustration, and other challenging behaviors. So it's almost, next slide, Matt, like a perfect recipe, what we have going on here for our students and loved ones on the spectrum to struggle. Matt and I have both said it, but you know, if you had told me a year ago that this is what a a classroom experience might look like, I would have been very confused. But this is what a lot of students are, experiencing on a daily basis. Next slide. School looks different at school. School looks different for some students when they're not at school. I live in Iowa City, and my kids are doing a lot of online learning. Again, wouldn't have expected it a year ago, but here we are. And that's been really challenging, as I'm sure you know, for a lot of students and a lot of families as well. Next slide. So I just wanted to put in a little plug that, I'm hearing parents express concern about their children and their child's adjustment, but a lot of parents are saying, I didn't sign up for this either, right? Most of us aren't teachers. We don't have that background. And if you have a child with some challenging behaviors, most of us aren't trained behavior coaches either. And so, you have a child maybe who's getting some special education support in school and had a predictable schedule. And now all of that has been, or much of that has been transferred to the home setting. Can be a very complex situation to navigate. Next slide. So general first approaches, I would say really think carefully about what is within your control. Hopefully I don't sound like a self-help guru. I'm not trying to come across that way, but we do need to focus on, for our children, what it is that we do have control over. Next slide. And I think there is quite a bit still that as parents we can provide some structure and predictability to. So I would say maintain as many of your child's routines as you possibly can, especially when there are these other things that we just honestly don't have control over. So what can we control? We can't make our kids go to sleep, obviously, but we can have some control over the time that they go to bed and what their bedtime routine looks like. Snacks and meals. As parents, we do have some control, right, over what our kids eat and when they eat it. Exercise and physical activity. A lot of research suggesting that can be very, very beneficial for everyone, including individuals on the spectrum. So we want to keep that programmed. Not always fun, but chores too. Important. We learn a lot through chores. And so we want to keep that in mind. And then finally, and I think this is maybe the most important thing, is we want to have a routine where we plug in or build in fun activities across the day for kids, things to look forward to. And we can do this, I think, in a predictable manner. Next. So this is just an example, a simple one, of what a routine might look like. This is for a child who gets up in the morning and the steps that they're going to follow as part of their morning routine. And again, just one example, it's going to look different, child to child, person to person, but hopefully that gives you a sense of what you might do. Now, for things like school, where the schedule has changed quite a bit, maybe your child's in a hybrid model. Some days they're at school, some days they're at home. My main recommendation is, once you know what the new looks like, try and establish routines around that. Let's try and make that as predictable as we can. So steps involved in that are, and I've had to do this myself, believe me, as a parent, and I have different kids and they all have different schedules, is trying to familiarize yourself with your child's school schedule. And again, this next little point is one that I have learned. Don't assume your child understands their schedule. It was like 2 weeks into school, and one of my kids, I'm not going to say which one, but was downstairs watching TV. And I'm like, aren't you supposed to be in school? And he said no. And I looked at his schedule and yeah, he was. So we need to be aware, and we need to help provide our kids with structures so that they're aware too of what they're supposed to be doing across the day. We talked about the value of scheduling, written or visual schedules, or both. So I think we want to individualize those, but the bottom line is make sure that we're providing our children with enough information that they know what they're supposed to be doing in that moment, and at the very least, what's coming up next. Again, visual cues for transitions can be really helpful. So if you have a child who struggles from going from one activity to the next, let them know when it's going to happen so they're not surprised. And just going back to that mantra I talked before about, what you practice, you get good at. So the more we do this, I think the more our children will get used to their new routine, and it'll just become automatic. Next slide. These are just some examples, and it's going to vary again, student to student. This might be for somebody who can keep track of every day of the week, what they're supposed to be doing. So you can explain to them and it's going to make sense. What am I doing on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday? So this might be a child in upper elementary school or beyond. The next one is an example of a child maybe who's receiving most of their instruction at home or being homeschooled. You could create your own schedule. And like I was talking about earlier, you can incorporate into that schedule both academic time as well as leisure time, chore time, but it's all built into the schedule. So the child knows what's going on within their daily routine. And I don't have time to go into a lot of detail on this. Dr. Ball mentioned this in his presentation, but there's been this approach called structured teaching, or the TEACH program, which is out of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which has been around for quite a while, 30 or 40 years. And it's a series of strategies that have been shown to be very helpful for a lot of individuals with autism in the areas of organization, work management, and really just understanding what to expect in their routines. And so the core components of a structured teaching program are here. And in the resources at the end of this talk, we've included some information from the TEACH program specific to COVID and some of the strategies that they feel like might be helpful for students. Just some quick visual examples next of what a TEACH program might look like at home. And I'm guessing many of you have some familiarity with this, but you can see this girl is sitting at a desk. There are not too many distractions, but she can visually see what it is that she's supposed to be doing. And she has some boxes next to her. One of the boxes on the left is probably what needs to be done, the tasks that she's expected to do. And when she finishes them, then she would move them to the red box on the right, meaning that they're completed. So it provides a lot of organization and visual support and eliminates distractions that can get in the way. This would be a very simple work schedule, and Dr. Ball referenced this in his talk. I feel like I keep saying that, but I really enjoyed his talk earlier. But this would just be a now next routine, right? First you do this sheet, then you get to take a break, and you could put pictures there of a work task in the now and a play task in the next. That would be a part of a structured teaching or TEACH type routine or schedule. And then this was discussed earlier as well, fortunately, because I want to save time for any questions that might exist. But helping prepare your child for these changes, because there are going to be changes, and curveballs are going to keep coming at us, I have no doubt, with COVID. So your child might be in school right now, but that might change in a few weeks, right? Or they may not be in school, and then hopefully they're going back more. But you can help prepare your child for changes by giving them choices at, when they're doing work at home. What work do they want to do first? Math, reading, etc. When they want to take their breaks? What are they working for if you're using a reinforcement plan? Giving them some choices there. And then flexibility training, which Dr. Ball discussed a little bit this morning, can help a lot with these unpredictable expectations. So different ways to do flexibility training. Next slide. One of the things that I use a lot with families and have had some success with is incorporating changes into routines in a predictable way. So you could use this change card to kind of signal to a child, oh, you know what? We thought we were going to do something, but now we're going to do something else. There's a change coming up. And it could be a really positive change your child's excited about. Instead of doing math, we get to go on a walk or have ice cream. And later on, it could be a less fun change. Instead of going outside, we're going to do one math problem first. But that can help with flexibility. And that takes time, but it can be a very successful strategy. For older children or children who cognitively can benefit more from what we would call a cognitive behavioral approach, there are some programs out there as well that target flexibility. And I'm not trying to promote any particular curriculum, but this is a nice one. this book called Superflex, which has been around for a few years now. And it's really nice because it's very visually, I think, appealing to a lot of kids. It uses a comic book format, but it just describes more cognitively what flexible and inflexible thinking is, and how somebody can move from being a little less flexible to a little bit more flexible. And you can apply this approach to different practice situations that a child might experience, to get them to the point, hopefully, where they can think and act more flexibly around their routines. So like we mentioned, we did want to include a lot of resources because we knew we wouldn't have time to go through everything. So I'm hopeful that this will give you additional information. So there are some of those social narratives. There is research on using the TEACH program or structured teaching. There is Iowa-specific information about special education rules and recs, and some nice examples of visual supports as well in general. So with that, I was hoping to have 10 minutes, but we have, I think, about 5 minutes, and I can certainly stick around longer. I don't know, Matt, if you have extra time or not. But happy to open it up if there are questions.